You're listening to Live from Lord North Street, a podcast from the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Kate Andrews, Associate Director at the IEA. One underexplored aspect of the global economy in recent decades has been an explosion in the creation, issuing, and enforcement of regulations. But is this emerging regulatory state necessary in the modern age, both to protect consumers and adapt to the changing needs of contemporary trade? Or is this weight of regulation excessive and harmful to competition? Some even argue that such rules, often issued by unelected officials and removed from voters, represent a threat to democracy itself. Yet increasing regulation is actually part of a global trend, with the US, China, and to a lesser extent Japan, also defining the trade landscape through their different systems. As Britain's withdrawal from the EU has revived an interest in these issues, the IEA's head of education, Dr. Stephen Davies, makes the case that the regulatory state and its push for harmonization is damaging competition. Back in 1970s Europe, he argues, you could determine good regulations from the bad by monitoring each country's individual rules and regulations and learning from best practice. On our podcast today, Steve and myself discuss these topics and more. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe to our podcast channel, IEA Conversations.
So, Steve, we're going to step back from the chaos and the politics of this week. I mean, when this podcast comes out at the end of the week, we don't even know what the state of play will be in Westminster. But we're going to stick on the subject of Brexit. I think what's going to be on a lot of people's minds right now is, how have we come to this point in which exiting the European Union, however you would like to exit, there are many different ways of doing that, the EEA option down to WTO rules, but this process of exiting is so incredibly difficult. So what I want to know is, what does Brexit tell us about the regulatory state? Why is getting out proving to be so difficult?
Well, that's an extremely good question. And I think it's fair to say that all of us have actually learned something from the experience of the British government in trying to exit the European Union. And what we've learned is something, I think, about the nature of the modern state or the contemporary state and the nature of trade policy, but more generally regulatory policy. Now, you may say, well, why is it so difficult? Surely, leaving a trade arrangement or even something more complicated as the European Union has become should not be that difficult. Don't you just give notice and, sort out a few odds and ends? The problem is essentially the nature of modern regulation. Back in the 19th century, states regulated the economy very, very lightly, if at all. And so negotiating trade deals or establishing economic relations with other countries was a very simple matter. When Britain and France negotiated the famous Free Trade Treaty in 1859-60, it only took them literally a matter of 2 or 3 months, and the entire treaty was really quite brief. Today, however, what we call trade deals are actually all about harmonizing regulations. And that's because every aspect of economic life is covered by an enormous mass of incredibly detailed regulations, health and safety regulations, quality regulations, a whole range of other kinds of regulations, many of which are the product of political pressures rather than anything economic. And it's these that are the major obstacles to trade or economic relations. Now, essentially, Britain, since it became part of the EEC way back in 1973, has become part of a regime where the regulations are made not by the British government anymore, but by this larger supranational body. And that process accelerated dramatically with the Maastricht Treaty. And what it means now is that trying to extricate yourself from that regulatory regime, it turns out, means having to rewrite or reset a whole range of regulatory rules. Now, what this tells us essentially is that the world now is divided up into a number of areas of which you may define as being regulatory agencies areas. And there are a certain number of states or bodies which are the major rule setters. Their regulations tend to be adopted or followed by many, many people. One is the United States. Another is increasingly China, but also to a lesser extent Japan, and another is the European Union. And other countries find that because these are the world's largest product markets, because they want to sell into those markets or invest in them, they have to at least be compatible with the regulatory regimes that those regulation creating bodies have set up. And those bodies, the European Union, the United States government and the others, are extremely difficult about people selling into their markets who aren't part of the package or haven't signed up to the full agenda that they've associated with it in the case of the European Union. And that makes the whole process of extricating yourself from this kind of enormous spider's web of regulations very, very difficult and very, very tricky. It's why trade deals take such a long time to negotiate these days, because they involve harmonizing or reconciling literally tens of thousands of pages of regulation.
It sounds like there's a monopoly in regulatory bodies or regulatory states or unions. I mean, they're not all exactly the same, but if they're just a few that are essentially determining how everybody else has to regulate, that can't possibly be good for competition.
Absolutely. The thing is this, originally, right back at the end of World War II, when this system that we now have began to be created through things like the GATT agreements and the various rounds of talks that it led to, pretty much every country had its own individual regulatory regime. So the regulations that, say, France had would be different from those in Germany, which would be different again from those in the United Kingdom, which would differ again from those in the United States. And even within the United States, there was much more variation at state level than there is now. And the tendency over the last 50 years, and particularly over the last 20 to 30 years, has been for this range of variety, if you will, and competition in regulation between different political entities to diminish dramatically. And this has been done in the interests, it's said, of greater trade, greater integration, longer supply chains, all this economic integration, in other words. But it also, of course, suits some people very much rather than others. In particular, it tends to suit large firms which have very long transnational supply chains and certain sectors, such as finance, which are almost by their very nature operating across borders. But it doesn't necessarily suit the part of the economy that's more domestic, if you will, companies, small and medium-sized enterprises which are selling mainly to a domestic market. They are now essentially governed by a regulatory regime which is created not by their own domestic government, but by a much more remote authority, whether that be the big regulatory agencies in Washington, D.C., or Brussels, or some other part of the world even.
Steve, one of the major criticisms of people who are more sympathetic to the regulations and rules governing from Brussels is that the regulatory state is a good thing. What Brexit tells us is that there are too many people in the UK who want to bin important regulations that protect workers' rights, keep us safe, make sure that products are of a high standard. Is it possible that what Brexit's really telling us is that there's political will from some voters to scrap these things, and actually we should think of the regulatory state as a good thing?
Well, I think actually in some sense the regulatory state is a good thing, in the sense that it's probably an essential function of the modern state. If you think about the functions of government, you can sort of divide them into three areas, really. There are the historic functions of government, such as war, running the judicial system, plus a number of functions it used to have and doesn't have any longer, such as upholding religious orthodoxy. Then on top of that, you have a set of functions that grew up in the late 19th to mid-20th century, things like providing public infrastructure, the welfare state and transfers, the state education system. Leave aside the question of whether or not it should be doing those things, that's another function it has. And then there's this third function of the regulatory state, which I think has really only grown up since World War II, and it's, in a way, it's sort of snuck up on everyone and taken them by surprise, because neither right nor left has really got a theory of how this works or what it should be doing or what the purpose of it is. And I think that in one sense, therefore, given the nature of modern economies, there has to be some form of regulation. Either the government has to do it, or it has to be done collectively and voluntarily by industrial associations and the like. And there are reasons why you might want the state to do it rather than private bodies. It depends on how you weigh up the balance of costs and benefits. The problem is that we do not have competition between different regulatory regimes. It's all very well to say, well, we would like to scrap some regulations and not others. If you had greater competition, if we were in the situation that we were in, say in the 1970s, where each European country pretty much had its own regulatory regime, then you could actually have experiments in which you would work out which regulations were unnecessary, superfluous, maybe too costly, and which ones maybe needed even tightening up. But when it's all being done at a continent-wide level, which encompasses a lot of very varied local circumstances, it's very difficult to do that. Not only that, there's a severe implication for democracy in all of this. Because when the nation state, which is the basic political unit, is the agency that's responsible for creating and issuing and enforcing regulations, there's an obvious and immediate political check on that through national elections, political competition at the level of the nation state. When the regulations are being done by a body or an agency which is very, very far removed from the electorate, and in the case of the European Union, not subject to that kind of democratic oversight, then things become very, very tricky. It's not clear what a lot of the purpose of politics at the national level is, because a huge amount of what has now become one of the major functions of the state has essentially been handed over either to unelected experts, which is a major feature in the United States, by the way, or to supranational bodies like the EU. And that must be a serious challenge for democracy, regardless of whether you're coming at this question from the free market or the left-of-centre position.
And this must be an unintended and yet very real consequence of the regulatory state, is that, again, whether you're on the free market side or you're on the center-left side, a lot of people talk about localism as a good thing, talk about devolution as a good thing, that people believe that decisions should be made on a more local level, that it's easier to legislate and also to retract bad legislation on a local level. But it's much harder to do that if you have a regulatory state from above that keeps tightening the rules and making it more and more difficult for the little guy essentially to break through.
Absolutely. And the point is that it may be that the legislation is going to be more informed, or there's going to be more political debate and discussion about it. But then if it turns out that there's a whole area of policy which you basically can't do much about, because if you do try to alter it or affect it, you're going to have to exclude yourself from the regulatory regime and therefore from a whole lot of trade links, then you begin to wonder what the point of a lot of politics actually is. And as I say, this is something which transcends the conventional division between, pro-market and social democrat or socialist or left and right. The kinds of policies that Jeremy Corbyn is very keen on, for example, are not compatible with the EU regulatory regime, as are a lot of radical free market policies. And those options are effectively removed from the table so long as you're part of this regulatory regime. But as I said at the start, it's proving to be the case that with the current way of thinking, it's very difficult to extricate yourself from this kind of system that's grown up internationally and transnationally since roughly the 1950s.
Well, that is, if it's delivered, supposed to be one of the benefits of Brexit, that you are able to make either significantly more left-wing or right-wing decisions amongst your own country, because you're away from the rules and the grasp of a European body that wouldn't let you go one way or the other. But this is quite funny, Steve, because many people are talking about leaving the European Union, looking to the rest of the world, becoming more global. And the United States is cited as one of the top countries that they think the UK would like to get a free trade agreement with. But if you're saying that it's not just the EU, but places like America that also have these massive regulatory bodies, are we fooling ourselves into thinking that the UK can ever escape from some of the more that the UK can ever escape from the constricting regulations that perhaps aren't protecting people and aren't aiding the economy as we'd like to think of regulations to be doing?
That is actually the case if you think in conventional terms. In other words, if you think in terms of conventional trade deals, in other words, working within the expectation that what you do is align with one or other regulatory regime, then what will happen is this: if you leave one regulatory regime, the single market of the European Union, to make a trade deal with the United States means that you then have to align a lot of what you're doing with their regulatory regime. Now, it may not be as intrusive, may not be as extensive, but that's basically what you'll have to do. You'll have to certainly align a significant part of your economy in that direction. The same would be true if you want to trade with other parts of the world. So it looked at from that perspective, this looks like a pretty grim situation. It means basically the choice you're left with is which external regulatory regime are you going to most closely fit with. However, I think there is an alternative. And the alternative is to go for a quite different way of dealing with trade, and that's a mutual recognition trade agreement. What you do there is you do not bother to align your regulations. You simply say, with regard to the other country or part of the world, look, we think you're competent, we think that your regulations are reasonably well done. Anything that you say is fit to be sold in your part of the world, we will allow to be sold in ours. And you can ask for this to be reciprocally extended. That particular strategy fits in with the other strategy that a country in Britain's position would be able to adopt, which is that of unilateral free trade, getting rid of tariffs and much more overt and obvious barriers to trade. The great benefit of that is that you can do it unilaterally. And it gives you a great advantage in terms of being an entrepot or middleman economy between these large regulatory blocks. Moreover, thinking about the future here, I increasingly don't think that these large, complex regulatory systems are going to survive, actually. They are so complicated now and so costly in terms of the effects that they have upon economic activity that it seems to me that in the medium term, certainly, they're going to simply break down. Because they're an attempt to impose order on something that is naturally immensely complex and not appropriate for planning and precise control in that respect. And so I think that actually we've probably reached the end of the road in terms of that model that we've been following since the creation of GATT and subsequently the World Trade Organization, I should say. And it is worth thinking about a completely different strategy.
Steve, that's actually quite hopeful. I mean, you never want things to break down without preparation because it means that people may get hurt in that process. But what you're saying is that we've reached peak regulatory state.
We may well have done. I think that essentially there are a number of fantasies on the market at the moment. There's a fantasy on the part of some, I think, rather naive free market people, which is that one country can simply scrap regulations and that's all you need to do. I would say that needs to be coupled with a much more aggressive kind of trade policy. And as I've said, a policy of essentially extending recognition wherever possible to other countries and not going through all these regulatory alignment talks. And another very naive view is the idea that somehow you can have a regulatory state like this and yet subject it to democratic control. That's simply not possible. We can see that at both the continental level of the United States, where the agencies that Congress has delegated its power to are essentially operating without any kind of oversight, and also in the European Union, where there's no democratic input or control into the regulatory process. Instead, it's captured and largely done at the behest of large corporate interests. And there's also, the fantasy actually lying behind all this that you can actually control the world to the kind of degree and with the kind of precision that these regulatory regimes embody. That's simply a delusion. The world is far more complicated and random than that. And trying to make it so orderly is going to have increasingly bad feedback and negative effects of one kind and another. So yes, I do think we've come to the end of a road in a way. The problem is we need to think much more carefully, I now realise, about what we do as part of the process of extricating ourselves from this web, as I've called it. And also, you have to be aware that there will be enormous pushback from the interests that benefit from the status quo, which means both governments and large private interests.
So, Steve, to wrap up, is mutual recognition the way that we can resolve the UK's exit from the European Union, or are fears and the fear-mongering around chlorinated chicken going to prevent us from having such a strategy?
I think actually it would work in the medium term. The problem is that we might do this unilaterally, but the EU might well refuse to play along, and they have all kinds of incentives for refusing to play along in the short term. I still think we should do it, but what that means is we should have very well worked out plans for dealing with and mitigating the short run effects, which is plans that we should have started work on, of course, 2 years ago. And it's an act of gross negligence by the government that they haven't advanced that planning more than they already have.
Well, we shall be hearing more from the government soon, and we'll have to return to the day-to-day antics of Brexit. But this has been a very good educational summary, I think, of what Brexit can tell us about the regulatory state. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
For more blogs, podcasts, films, and reports, visit our website at iea.org.uk.